Welcome to another edition of Moral Side of the News. We're glad you're with us. I'm John Blim with the WHAS Crusade for Children. With me again this week is a distinguished panel. Rabbi Gaylia Rooks, the Temple, Reverend Daniel Corrie Shull, Burnett Avenue Baptist Church, Reverend Jason Crosby, Crescent Hill Baptist Church, and Father Joe Graffis, Archdiocese of Louisville. We begin today's discussion with the hot button topic, critical race theory. Kentucky Republican State Senator Max Wise wants to eradicate critical race theory from Kentucky classrooms. He has filed a bill outlining what and how kids should be taught about our nation's history. His proposed bill says that says students should be taught slavery, segregation, and racial discrimination are, quote, contrary to the fundamental American promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But blaming racial disparities solely on the nation's history is, quote, destructive to the unification of our nation. The House bill sparked outcry from educators who said the broad list of banned topics would block them from teaching the ugly parts of our country's history. It would also prohibit schools from requiring educators to discuss current events with students or participate in race-related training. So panelists, please share your thoughts and reaction to this.
Well, I would first say that Max Wise is the casualty of an inept education. Clearly, he has not been exposed to the historic realities of the American empire and how the history of America still has consequences in its present. I think it is noteworthy that so many of our politicians, our elected officials, spend so much time and energy attempting to silence any conversation about the past, about history, instead of attempting to shape the future. And so it is incredulous that he would file such legislation. I have many ideas as it relates to legislation that should be filed, that would progress the Commonwealth. There are many things that we should put into motion to create a better Kentucky for our citizenry, but instead we have people like Max Wise who would prefer to keep children ignorant and to keep us mired in silliness and repeating the tragic mistakes of our past than pushing forward to a brighter tomorrow.
You know,
Corrie, go ahead, Gaylia.
I want to say something about what Corrie said. Is that what you wanted to do too, Jason?
Go ahead.
I mean, I agree with everything you're saying, Corrie, except I think you give too much credit when you say that Wise and that his following, the people who are against teaching critical race theory, when you say that they're more interested in looking at the past than the future. I think this is very much their agenda to change the way children are taught, because that will change the future, and to deny the fact that not only was that not a constitutionally protected right, and the incredible inequities that, I mean, would take generations and generations to make more equitable and fair, gives him too much credit, or not enough credit for what he's trying to do. I think that Max Wise is definitely thinking about the future of this country and not just the past. And he wants to, I guess the word whitewash might be a good term to use here. Jason, you want to jump into?
Well, Gaylia, we were on the exact same page. And I'll just kind of illustrate that point with an anecdote. When right-wing fundamentalists took over Southern Baptist Theological Seminary several decades ago, professors who did not agree to adhere to the party line to every degree were fired. And one of those professors who was at the seminary at the time and was dismissed is a friend, and who regularly asked me, Jason, who were the professors that were first dismissed when the new regime took place? And when he first asked me that, I thought, well, it must have been the biblical scholars. He said, no, guess again. I said, well, it must have been the theologians. He said, no, guess again. I said, well, the ethicists. He said, no, guess again. He said it was the church historians who were the first batch of professors to be dismissed because in order to institute a completely different regime in that moment and to shape the future, the historical narrative had to be mythologized in new ways. So we were on the same page, Corrie, in response to the way in which what's happening right now in Frankfurt is certainly dragging us back into the past, but it's an attempt to reshape the present and the future in ways that benefit folks that look a lot like Max Wise. Also, I think it's worth remembering that this is not just something that's happened in religious education circles in the last few decades. Almost 100 years ago, in 1936, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, on December the 10th, 1936, erected a monument in the rotunda of the Capitol in Frankfurt. And that monument was a statue of none other than Jefferson Davis, who was a traitor to our country. And so in the 1930s, you had a real push, in particular in that time frame, to rewrite the history that had unfolded in just the couple previous generations. This is a play that has been run from the conservative white supremacist playbook, not just for decades, but at this point for centuries, in both religious circles and in political circles.
Yeah, well, I think it will re-mythologize American history for a new generation, but it will paralyze American progress and the progress of Kentucky. We need to be talking about how we will make Kentucky a leader in this new industry as it relates to energy. We saw the governor push us in that direction with his with the contract that he signed with, I believe it was Ford, and how we will be on the vanguard of this new energy concept with vehicles. We need to be talking about how we're going to turn all these tobacco farms into marijuana farms. We know that it will yield $14 billion to our state, and yet we're allowing Nevada and California and other places to run out ahead of us as opposed to our being progressive, thereby developing a brighter future for Kentuckians. We need to be talking about legalizing gambling in Kentucky. Hey, we are losing probably millions, if not billions of dollars to Indiana every single year because Kentuckians are driving across the bridge in order to gamble. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not placing a value judgment on gaming or on gambling. What I am saying is Kentucky needs to be an active competitor with states that are bordering us. And so what I see in the continued filing of this type of legislation, it keeps us from doing the real work of pushing Kentucky forward and just keeps us mired in the same arguments, the same whitewashing of history. Hey, history has been whitewashed all of my life. I grew up in schools that whitewashed history. They had Black History Month. You heard about Martin Luther King. You heard about Rosa Parks, but Black history didn't go much further than that. You cannot shut up the truth. The truth will get out. Now, you can keep Kentucky economically disenfranchised. You can keep Kentucky backwards as it relates to the revolution that's happening with energy in this country. You can do that if you would like to. And I think that our legislature, our legislators, our lawmakers are just really doing a terrible job at being visionary as it relates to what Kentucky should be outside of the classrooms. And if these people are so concerned about what is being taught in classrooms, they ought to start teaching they ought to go back and get their teaching licenses, and they should teach. Otherwise, they should stick to their day jobs and file laws that is going to impact the trajectory of Kentuckians as a whole.
I think a couple things that I think about here is, number one, I'm always a little uneasy when the legislature is trying to restrict curriculum, because I don't think they're most part teachers. And I mean, I think we need to have the professionals to do that. We don't need the government to do that kind of stuff. So that's the first question, saying, well, you can teach this, but you can't teach that. That's a problem. And then it gets into the whole philosophical question that some of the people on the far right are like libertarians. The government should not interfere in my life. And yet they're the very ones doing this, which seems like a reversal of logic. I studied logic and philosophy in college, and it's like, what? That doesn't follow at all. I think thirdly, we use these catchphrases. I was never comfortable with defunding the police. I thought that was a terrible catchword, and it's become very controversial because it did not describe what was really being asked for. And critical race theory is kind of become the catchword, although it's not used in grade school or high school. It's a college term, and it's dealing with a whole different level of education, and now we're trying to apply it to everything else. And Corrie, I agree with you. I remember growing up. I grew up obviously in an all-white school. It wasn't until I got to high school that I met my first African-American classmates, and it was a great excitement and thrill because they were absolutely great people. But then I started doing a lot of reading, and obviously, and saying, well, the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, and whoa, I never heard about all this kind of stuff. I think our country was founded on great principles. But we all know that the founding fathers, while they had great principles, they didn't always see the implications of where those principles might lie. They were thinking of themselves as landed farmers. They didn't think of women. They didn't think of many other things there. So our principles are important, but to say like he said that, any American succeed if they're given sufficient opportunity. Well, yeah, but we haven't given sufficient opportunity to a lot of people in our history. And people need to know about that. Now, fortunately, we've overcome slavery, but it took a long time to overcome slavery. Why did it take so long?
Have we really overcome it?
Well, exactly. I mean, and that's just one thing. I mean, women's vote, my grandmother couldn't vote. My mother just got the vote when she was just about the time she was able to vote. I think we know that history always tells us what can we learn from history so we can go forward. I agree with Corrie about going forward, but I love history. But history tells us some things we don't like to hear. We could probably say that I could certainly say that about the Catholic tradition. Oh my God, even in recent times. I'll never forget 1970 when the pastor took me as a deacon up to the top of the church and said, this is for the colored only signs. This is 1970. And he said, these signs were up in this church just 8 years ago. And I was stunned, what? And, we need to know that history and why, because that also helps us to know all of our brothers and sisters. I was talking to a public school teacher last night about something else, but she's in a new school, came back to teach after retiring, and she's dealing with a lot of Hispanics and Hispanic kids, and she's not familiar with the Hispanic community, but over the years she's got to meet a lot of families, and she said they're delightful people. She said, I love the Hispanics, and the kids are so well behaved. She said, I don't understand the problem about these people are so desperate. I've heard their stories. And I said, well, remember 2 years ago, you didn't know anything about that? She said, yeah, but now At my age, I'm learning about that. And I said, we all need to hear the stories of others, and history is his and her story. Anyway, long sermon.
I think Max Wise and those who agree with him, and there is a movement to turn the clock back. And somebody needs to tell them, we're not going back. Women will not be relegated to the sort of a place of forgottenness, a place of patriarchy and sexism. We're not going back. We're not going back where Black people are relegated to second-class citizenship. We're not going back to a place where Hispanics and Latinos and other ethnic groups are relegated to an invisible status. We're not going back. It does not matter the legislation that is filed. The truth will get out.
Well, in Corrie and everyone, I mean, I think that part of the impetus for this legislation, and I believe it's stated as much in the proposed bill, is the avoidance of guilt and shame. But my understanding of what repentance entails, guilt and shame are not the ultimate outcome. You know, we encounter truths, the whole truth about wrongs in our own lives. And until someone who is trying to keep something in a closet is willing to directly confront the whole truth of perhaps a personal error, they will never be able to go forward in a better, more fulfilling, more abundant way of life. The same applies collectively to our society. You know, repentance means, in the Greek and the Bible, metanoia, changing one's mind so that one can then change one's behavior and direction. You know, some shame and guilt about encountering some things that perhaps my grandparents were a part of might be a part of that process, but that's not the end of it. The end of it is to then recognize that and go forward in a more healthy, abundant, beneficial way for all members of our community.
But that's the issue, Jason. That's the issue, because there can be no repentance without reparations. If I
acknowledgement of the wrong.
Yeah, acknowledgement is good, but you've also got to repay. I can't steal your car.
Repay, you have to acknowledge. I'm sorry, I don't see people acknowledging. You know the phrase that history is written by the victors? I thought that the South lost the war. I mean, this whole critical race theory, you know, is just stunning to me. They say that the arc of history bends towards justice, and it needs a bigger push in that direction now. I totally agree. Reparations, I mean, how you can ever undo the damage of hundreds of years. I was listening to something last night about how the superhighways and the freeways, you know, in our states are the dividing line, and how much damage it's done to especially the African-American community. I mean, it will take generations of really sincere repentance and hard work to even begin to shift towards righteousness here. But if you're trying to move backward in time, which not just this, I mean, the issue of pro-choice and women's rights, and you know, John, in your opening statement, you said something about how critical race theory, you weren't saying, you were quoting. I should
take that
out of your mouth. That it works against the unification of our nation.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't. Banishing critical race theory, which isn't even what it should be called, but anyway, but ignoring the necessity of that is what is working against the unification of our country. Oh, sorry, but only if you consider our country to include the descendants of enslaved Americans. And I just don't understand how we are supposed to move forward when politically so many people are trying to drag us backwards. in ways, I mean, if anything, you would think that they would be cognizant. They're so concerned about rewriting history, revising history. Aren't they concerned about how history will view them?
I think we've got to, it reveals that the heart of this nation is steeped in white supremacist Christianity. Look at the way we talk about Black people. Look at the way we talk about Jewish people. Look at the way we talk about Islamic people. If you're not white and Christian, this nation does, and male, this nation does not see you as a legitimate citizen. And I would say, I don't know that I would say white Christian and male, because I think white men have always created a space for their women. White women have always been held in a protected space in American society. That's why so many Black men were lynched for looking at a white woman, or for speaking to a white woman, for not averting their eyes when they looked at a white woman, because the white woman was a prized human being.
A prized possession, I would say, but okay.
You're right, a prized possession. She was a possession of the white man.
And certainly,
one other point that I hate to get away from this, but I know our time is running. From the biblical perspective, I've always, and I think our Jewish brothers would agree, that, so often we are blind, and we're spiritually blind. We're blind in a lot of ways. And Jesus was always talking about, let the blind see. And sometimes understanding our history says, we see in different ways. A very dumb, simple example. I was with some of my grade school classmates, and I won't go into all that, but we were just discussing back in the day when I was serving as an altar boy, none of the girls could serve. Mm-hmm. And we never thought anything about that. And they said, we never thought much about it either. But now we'd never want that to happen because we had blinders on. We just bought into a myth or a society that said, well, this is what you do and this is what you do. And that was not a healthy way, even from God's eyes. And so I think trying to remove those blinders and the blindness that we see, taking off those kind of things, is part of what history teaches us. Not to feel guilty, although, you do feel, okay, some sacred answers, we own slaves. I was this morning with the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth. They owned slaves when they started because people gave them slaves, but they've repented and tried to do some reparations for that. That's the whole idea of going from darkness to light. Maybe I should use different words, but scriptures talk about that.
I really believe that if white Christians would get serious about loving our neighbor, and that is central to this message. If white evangelicals ever got serious about that, most of this silliness would be a thing of the past. But because white Christians will not embrace the central message of Jesus, and they continue to undergird this type of vitriol in our society, we will continue to have these conversations, and we will continue to suffer with injustices meted out on the backs of Black people, Jewish people, gay, lesbian, transgender people, and all the other persons of our society that are marginalized.
Well, in Corrie,
it wouldn't be just Jesus, it would also be the prophets of the Old Testament.
Right.
But,
well, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus is quoting Leviticus. Go ahead.
Absolutely, 19.
Go ahead,
Corrie, I think what you were saying is summed up so often in a lot of Christians talk a lot about Jesus, but a lot of Christians spend a lot of time tap dancing around actually listening to and following Jesus. So in addition to this, it's going to require mass white Christian re-theological education, deconstruction and reconstruction, how they understand the Bible, how they understand theology, because the preeminent brand of white Christianity in America is not teaching the ways of Jesus. One. Two, another aspect of this is that the kids are already having these discussions. Mm-hmm. My fifth grader, he is 11 years old. He is already in a place in his life where he knows more about the Black history in America and systemic racism than I knew when I was 31 years old. And that's a good thing.
Great.
But to think that those kind of conversations, due in no small part to the fact that Republican legislatures keep talking about CRT, the kids then are curious. They're only fanning the flames. You know, in Tennessee, last week, McMinn County outlawed the book, the young adult novel Mouse in McMinn County. Well, this week it's the #1 seller in its particular category. That's the other realistic outcome of this, is that the next generation, as Corrie has said, they're not going to stop, and they're tougher than we think, and they want to know. They have tender hearts and open minds, and they're willing to deal with this.
One of my favorite political commentators, Brian Tyler Cohen, I pulled this up because I had taken a picture of it. Responding to Lauren Bobbert's posting, "The Constitution is not evolving. To say that spits in the face of every single one of our founders." And he responded, "Remind us again how women got the right to vote," which was just so perfect in so many ways. You know, my mother-in-law is constantly, like, every right and just cause that I fought for my whole life, that I thought was, you know, we had moved beyond that. It's all, she said, she apologized. I guess I didn't do a very good job of it, because now you have to do it again and your children have to do it again. It staggers the mind how much people would like to more than put on blinders. It's very discouraging. We have 1 minute left. John is telling us 1 minute.
It has been a long time. Go ahead. It's been a long time since I've had one question.
I think we're all in agreement here that as the religious community, we've got a responsibility in all of this to teach the truth. Lord knows what's truth to a lot of people. The famous words of Pilate. But you know, the misinformation, and so much of the stuff that we read in that article was misinformation, and it's like, you know, and yet how do you do that gently with people who are everybody else, all those liberals are taking over the world, and whatever that means, is like, okay, can we agree on facts? And, you know, can we have facts of history?
Well, we live in postmodernism, and a tenet of postmodernism is there is no truth. There are no facts.
And I have to wrap up this edition of Moral Side of the News. It's been a long time.
We're not passionate about anything.
Since we've only had
for Reverend McLean. Prayers for Reverend Sally McLean.
Right. And her husband, Eric, may rest in peace.
She's doing okay. I talked with her the other day.
But thank you, Joe Graffis, Gaylia Rooks, Corrie Shull, and Jason Crosby. Join us again next week for another edition of Moral Side of the News. Thank you, panel. See you next time.